morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Very happy to welcome you for this discussion today. So today we will talk about Yemen. This event is called 24 million in reference to the number declared of people in need of some kind of humanitarian assistance in the country of Yemen. So this will be a discussion, casual discussion with four amazing, fantastic women, Arab women, Yemeni women who will talk for themselves. And we will cover different topics. For once, the humanitarian situation in the country and the impact that it has on particularly women and girls. But also, we will talk on the impact of the conflict on the civilian population from a psychological aspect and health perspective. And we will talk also about the action of women in the peace building field and the peace process, the impact of the international community and their role and responsibility in this conflict. And then we will, so the structure will be first interventions from the speakers for half this event, probably around 35 minutes. And then we will open up the floor for questions from the audience for an interactive discussion. So the event is planned to be conducted for 1 hour 15. And before I introduce Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, our founder of WCAPS and leader, and the speakers, I would like to thank very warmly the amazing team that has been involved in organizing this event. The event is hosted by the Race Across the Pond initiative. That is a project from WCAPS Global that aims to explore the impact of constructed race and racism on peace and security internationally, and particularly the human security of BIPOC communities in the world. And it is co-sponsored by four amazing, by our working groups and teams from four working groups: the International Development, the Human Rights, the Southwest Asia and North Africa working group, and lastly, but not least, the Conflict Resolution, Peace Building and Peacekeeping working group. So I really want to thank you all for participating. And of course, I want to thank the speakers for being here on such short notice. Thank you for the audience, all of you, for joining from quite many countries, up to actually Argentina, which is very far. So I'll let Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins introduce herself and have the floor, and I will pass it on to the speakers after that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this wonderful introduction to all of us for what the discussion you're about to have today. I want to also thank you and Race Across the Pond series, all of the leadership in WCAPS who put this together, including particularly the leadership from all the different working groups. And I think what everyone, and I'm Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, I'm founding executive director. I keep forgetting to say that. I think that I look forward to the discussion, and I think what you're seeing here is a great collaboration from different parts of the organization, which really reflects the fact that there are so many issues that we, as women of color and as women in many parts of the world, are affected by and need to focus on. And I'm glad that we can have this space to have this conversation, an important conversation. And I hope that after we have this conversation, that people continue to discuss these issues because they are so important to all of us. So thanks for taking the time to do this, and the amazing panelists. Just getting a chance to read a little bit about all of you. I'm so glad that you're able to share with us your expertise and knowledge and your experiences with us, which is really an honor for all of us. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Sarah, for what will be a great event. And if you want to know more about WCAPS, which we'll put some stuff in the chat about the organization, and which we've been around since 2017. We have amazing chapters, particularly one in France that Sarah's helping to lead. And so there's a lot of ways to get engaged with us and promoting the voices of women in so many parts of the world. That's so important. So thanks again for doing this. Thank you to amazing leadership for putting this together. And thanks for all the panelists for everything you do. Thanks a lot. Back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. It's really an honor to be part of WCAPS, and really thank you for again creating this space where we can actually share, explore, and and network with amazing women and also men. Especially as I see there is we have one man here. Hi, Paul, and maybe more actually. So I will hand over to Nesma to introduce herself very quickly, and then each one. Actually, sorry, I will introduce them, and then I will hand over to each one. So Nesma Mansour is a young Yemeni woman and human rights defender. She works in the humanitarian field, and she's an advocate for human rights, including women and youth rights, since 2013. She is currently working as the communication and advocacy officer for Peace Track Initiative, which is a Yemeni led organization, and a member of the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership and Women's Solidarity Network. Can you wave a hi, Nesma, please? Thanks. And then we have Sarah Elizabeth Dill. She's a lawyer based in Washington, D.C. She works on human rights, war crimes, foreign policy, and international finance. She currently serves as the International Bar Association's Arab Region Liaison Officer for war crimes and international criminal law. Hi, Sarah. We also have Dr. Aisha Juman. She has over 30 years of experience in public health, including viral vaccine preventable diseases, cervical and breast cancer research, surveillance, maternal child health and nutrition, primary health care, and women in development. She's fantastic, just as all of them. Dr. Juman is an American Yemeni woman. She currently is working as an independent consultant, coordinating health-related projects in Yemen. Can you say hi? Great. And last but not least, Summer Nasser. She is a speaker and analyst on Yemeni affairs and is the CEO of Yemen Ed, a humanitarian organization and international licensed NGO in Yemen, established in late 2016 in response to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Summer is a Yemeni American born in the Bronx borough and raised in New York City. Hi, Summer. All right, so we'll start now. I will hand over to you, Summer, to start speaking. If you could tell us a little bit on the humanitarian situation in the country and the impact of the conflict on the humanitarian relief access, and particularly for women and girls, please.
Well, thanks for having me and creating this amazing space. As you guys are aware, we're making this a very casual conversation, so nothing very formal. I'm going to talk a little bit just about where we were in Yemen at one point before the Arab Spring, and how that actually created, or one of the attributes to the humanitarian crisis as well. Yemen post 2011 and prior to 2011 is very different. And before 2011, Yemen's economic crisis, which is one of the most important attributes to why the humanitarian crisis is still one of the worst in the world. During the Arab Spring, essentially, one of the causes of that was to create change and give economic prosperity to youth. And essentially, youth are pretty much the majority population. About 70% of the population are youth in Yemen. And so the Arab Spring came along, conflict came after that, and that created a very big gap in why we're in a humanitarian crisis as well today. right now, currently, where we stand in the economic crisis, you have two different lens that you have to look at in Yemen. The first is um, you have two different central banks. You also have currencies that value differently in Sana'a versus in Aden. And so that also impacts how the currency and how the inflation works on the ground. There is an impact in salaries, again, due to political tensions between Aden and Sana'a as well. And I'm sure someone will tap into that later on. But really, it's diverted from the economic crisis. And then that creates the different problems that we have now today, where there are people, there's an abundance of food, an abundance of food. And unfortunately, not a lot of people can pay for that because of the economic crisis, the loss of jobs, the instability of pay, salaries and such. When we're talking about the health sector, and I think for me personally, the health sector is one of the most important, the health sector and the education. I think if you want to change any nation and advancement, you have to focus on these two sectors. The health sector, which I'm sure Dr. Aisha will talk about later on, essentially is unfortunately almost non-existent, in a way where resources are lacking. We have about 50 to 60% of the facilities that are closed in Yemen due to the conflict. And then also we have the issue of COVID, which again, Dr. Aisha may end up talking about later on. But in all the similarities between all these crises is that they don't have a lot of support. The Ministry of Health faces again two different, one de facto military, sorry, not military, Ministry of Health versus the government Ministry of Health, and so there's a lot of policies changing and intertwining in between these requests and supplies. COVID cases as today stands around 2,100 cases. Now, do not take this number seriously. I don't personally, I do not believe this. Again, we're lacking a lot of resources. Just to give you an understanding of the COVID crisis at Yemen is, at this time, from my understanding, there's about 23,000 kits only to date in a country of around 29, 30 million people. And so that's really disastrous. And I don't have any other word to kind of describe it. We have facilities that are run by INGOs, facilities that are run by Ministry of Health with just a lack of resources again, and financial support. And then we have a lot of institutions and medical centers that are actually closed because they don't have the funding to support it. We have, unfortunately, like again, the COVID cases, in most cases, from the statistics that we see right now, is mostly males, about 70%. And then about 20% are female. And I'm assuming that's because maybe men usually tend to go out more than women, and such. So there's much more difference from a cultural perspective. Now, Sarah and I spoke yesterday, and I wanted to tap into this. And I think she also wanted me to tap into this, which is the humanitarian access. Uh, you know, the food sector, obviously, as you, some of us already know, is that 2/3 of the country is falling under malnutrition. These statistics are important for us, but at the same time, it's why is that? Why is it after 6 years we're still working and not getting enough results? And it's because of the humanitarian access on the ground, and what are we capable of versus what the reality is on the ground. And personally, for Yemen Aid, on a basis of experience, we've had less than 5 incidents of either getting detained, our team getting detained, or just the lack of the political nuances of how to kind of approach and get these licenses going for projects. But women are most impacted when it comes to the humanitarian access. And that means they're not allowed to move from place to place. So for example, in Sana'a, under Houthi authorities, women have to travel with what you call a legal guardian. I guess that can be disputed religiously, but in that sense, we've actually had cases, hundreds of cases, where they've been harassed and detained, and sometimes just returned back to where they are if they don't have any legal guardian, which then impacts how to approach these projects, because a lot of them are led by women. So that also impacts. We have also under government control, we have detained staff incidents that happen. So specifically in Aden, for example, and that also happens to us from time to time. And then in Hodeidah, you also have uh, another issue of a layer of politics, which is local authority changing their minds about certain structural processes of the projects. We have, even after agreements have been changed. So we have, in all, we have about, even let's say, for example, from the month of November to December, from my understanding, we had over 400 incidents just on humanitarian access, whether it's pausing projects that are really life-saving. And a lot of these incidents are actually in areas of Sana'a, Hodeidah specifically. We've had less than about 100 incidents, or 100 or so, under government authority. And so that's Aden and what you see the south and the central of Yemen. So that's the humanitarian access. And unfortunately, we call, whether it's domestic interference or international policing, which is the FTO that was recently given by the Trump administration, we really recognize that these are essential problems to how we kind of approach aid. And for us, we as Yemen Aid, not a lot of people also face this, but for us, we've had a lot of issues with areas under Houthi control where licenses are not respected, and so we work with sub-implementers to go around that to avoid any issues. Now, water sector is one of the biggest problems again in Yemen, and the lack of access to water really prevents health advancement. And so, like, for example, prevention of diseases, even the basic cholera diseases and such. And so we work a lot in this area where this also impacts girls, where they end up not able to go to school just because they have to go and get water for the family or for the community. And that really deters their childhood at the end of the day, and their advancement and development as a whole. And so I know we have time that's very short, so I'm trying to like get through this as quickly as possible. But I do want to touch upon one more thing, and we can talk about more of the humanitarian statistics later on, is that there is really a very big problem in the approach of humanitarian access in Yemen. And I think we have to, again, look at the country in two folds. We have countries or patches of areas that are in conflict, continuous conflict, versus a more stable, not necessarily the best situation, but more about livelihood and just rebuilding what they have lost. And so a lot of the cases is that the status quo projects, which is, let's say, food baskets and such, is temporary. It's not a solution. And that's, again, why we're not seeing such great numbers and results in the humanitarian crisis. We have to address sustainable development to kind of get long-term benefits over time. So we'll talk about that later on.
Thank you so much, Summer, for these great insight. And I'm actually gonna jump to Aisha, because you talked about Summer. You talked about the humanitarian situation and actually the impact that it has also on health. So maybe Aisha, you can talk a little bit about that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Summer, for a very good introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the humanitarian crisis as it impacts population health, because that's my area of expertise. If I can get my presentation start moving. Okay. I always like to start with a picture of Sana'a. Sana'a is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I also want to show the world how beautiful Yemen is, because all they hear about is death and destruction. So this map shows the current malnutrition crisis in Yemen, which is very severe. As you can see, in October to December 2020, Yemen has a lot of food insecurity. Actually, all of Yemen has a lot of food insecurity. There isn't any area in Yemen that is food secure. And the projection for this year up to June of 2021, we're going to have 16.2 million people who are food insecure. And as you can see, the red areas get larger. What this means is that about 25% of people in these red areas will die if we don't support them immediately. This is just showing a map of cholera in Yemen. And unfortunately, Yemen has recorded the largest cholera outbreak in the world, and actually in history. We have over 2 million suspected cholera cases in the 21st century, which is a shame on all of us. This is a map showing dengue fever cases by governorate in Yemen. There are over 62,000 dengue fever cases, and the yellow areas shows where the cases are. And every dot represents 50 cases. This shows the epidemiologic curve for diphtheria cases in Yemen for 2019 and 2020. Yemen had not had a diphtheria outbreak since 1980. Yet, of course, because of the war and the destruction that's going on and the malnutrition, which also makes kids very vulnerable to infectious diseases, we see that we have now diphtheria cases in Yemen. And the red line is showing the fatality rate, which is quite high. Unfortunately, it got up to 30% on week 23 of 2020. We also have measles cases. And again, and a measles outbreak and Sada having the largest number of cases. And usually in epidemiology, when we start seeing measles outbreak, we know that the health sector is really strained. This is an epi curve of severe acute respiratory infections, again, comparing 2019 to 2020. And as you can see, Yemen had a huge outbreak of severe acute respiratory infections in the winter of last year with quite high fatality rate. And then we come to 2020 and we see here a high fatality rate, almost reaching over about 25%. And that is when COVID-19 started in Yemen. If we look at the COVID-19 map, and as Summer said, and I agree with her, we don't have statistics for multiple reasons. One is the governorates in the north have decided that they're not going to be sharing the number of cases. They are counting them, but they're not sharing them. The governorates in the south started sharing them, but in October of 2020, decided they're not going to share any more cases. But I do want to point out to Hadramaut specifically because Hadramaut had some of the best reporting. And the most important part of here is not the number of cases and the number of deaths, but the percent of death. So COVID-19 resulted in about 30% fatality in Yemen, which is the highest in the world. The impact of COVID-19 is also impacting hunger in Yemen. So there was a survey that was done in Yemen, and people said fear of hunger surpasses COVID-19. Concerns of the desperate Yemeni survey. Those surveyed indicated their top concerns are rising food prices and the loss of income, even more than getting sick. The economic impact of COVID-19 is having on people's lives is causing more harm than the disease itself. And I'm also the founder and president of Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. We also do relief work and we distribute food baskets in addition to other programs. And when we distribute food baskets and talk to people about COVID-19, because we also distribute masks, we've had families from Aden to Lahij to Hudaida to Sana'a who tell us very specifically that they would rather die of COVID-19 than die of hunger because that would be a more painful death. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen, I want to say, is man-made. Emergency Relief Coordinator reiterates that Yemen is being starved while the Security Council echoes calls for action. So this is something that is political and can be solved by a political solution. So in addition to all that's going on in Yemen and what people are experiencing, we now have this designation by the Trump administration. And the impact of that is going to have reduced funding for a humanitarian response. It's going to halt the work of international aid agencies. It's going to freeze financial services to Yemen. Banks will refuse to transfer funds to Yemen. And I'm sure, I know from our Yemen relief work, is there are many times when the funds are returned from Yemen for one reason or another. Now we cannot even send funds in dollars. We have to send them in euros. So there is always a problem. And with this designation, it's going to be even worse. Shipping companies and insurance companies would refuse to deliver goods to Yemen. There are estimates from the UN that the prices would go 400%. It will exacerbate an already dire humanitarian crisis and push the majority of population into full-fledged famine. I want also to talk about a lot of organizations that have come against this designation. This is an open letter to the Secretary of State on the proposal to designate the Houthi as a foreign terrorist organization. These are all foreign ambassadors or foreign service individuals who have worked in the Middle East, from Barbara Bodine, who was the ambassador to Yemen, all the way to Susan Ziada, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And basically what they say, we urge the administration not to take this step, which we believe would be deeply damaging to the US national security interests, including the fight against terrorism, and most of all to the innocent civilians in Yemen. Aid agencies also reacted extremely negatively to the designation. Reckless and destructive. Refugees International, deeply concerned about the harmful effect Mercy Corps will hamstring the ability of aid agencies to respond, NRC Yemen and East Africa, counterproductive and dangerous, Oxfam America, pure diplomatic vandalism, Rescue Org. In addition, the UN also has come against it. This is the Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock. He did a briefing on January 14th to the UN, and these were the questions that he posed and the answers that he also had. What is the likely humanitarian impact? Large-scale famine on a scale that we have not seen for nearly 40 years. Would licenses and exemptions for aid agencies prevent that? The answer is no. What would prevent it? A reversal of the decision. Also, January 24, aid agencies make unprecedented and united call for Biden administration to revoke Ansarullah terrorist designation, with 22 aid organizations signing this letter. I also want to talk a little bit about our mission because when I was talking to Sarah yesterday, she wanted me to mention this. So Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, it was also established in response to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. We didn't start until mid of 2017. So our mission was to increase awareness of the US public and policymakers about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, support the relief and reconstruction effort, and facilitate peace initiative. And the reason I wanted to mention that is because we do a lot of advocacy. On the 25th, we worked with multiple organizations. There were about 380 organizations globally that called for an end to the war on Yemen. And we had speakers, parliamentarians from around the globe. There were over 20 countries that participated with over 30 rallies against the war in Yemen. This is my last slide. We do need to end the war on Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for this great presentation. I would like to emphasize that I really appreciate both of your presentation. We often hear astronomical numbers about Yemen. The population is about 29 million people. 80% is in need of some form of humanitarian assistance. 2.1 million children are suffering from moderate or acute malnutrition. 20 million people are food insecure. They're just numbers that are completely crazy, and you are providing some key elements to understand what it means for in the field, these numbers actually. So thank you very much. I'd like to pass on to Nesma, and it would be really great to hear about, you are coming back from Yemen actually. You're in Paris, if I'm not mistaken, and you are coming from Aden, from Yemen, which you have left some month ago, actually, last year. So can you talk about the impact of the conflict on the civilian population, particularly women and girls, the psychological effects, and anything that you have in mind?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for Summer and Aisha. I haven't prepared much on COVID, so it's good that it's have been already covered. And I will take the chance today to really talk about the three main points that I want to cover. my personal experience living in war in Yemen for the past 6 years and the effects on me, in also on the reflection on the effects of women and young people, our advocacy work on women inclusion, and just shifting the narrative. We heard a lot about how Yemeni people are suffering from both presentations, but I really would like to invite you to look at the other picture, which is the resilience of Yemeni people, especially the Yemeni women who I work with every single day. And there is no day where they can't amaze me, and their resilience amaze me, and how strong they are, although we see these horrific numbers. And the third thing, and if I had time, I would like to talk on protection issues, specifically on the protection of Yemeni women. So, if all of us know, Yemen was already before war a militarized nation. More than 60% of the households in Yemen had guns in their house. Yemen was ranked one of the top nations that had arms. At least something we are top at, because in every index we are at the at the bottom. And I personally experienced firsthand how it is to live in a area where there is military camps around you. In Aden, in my district, Khormaksar, there are 4 military camps in very small districts, and every day there is something happening regarding these military camps, and their impact is awful on the population. And we also saw in Sana'a how Jabal Attan have, with all of the arms in it, have led to a massive destruction. And this awful, the war had an awful toll on all the Yemenis. It had a very awful impact mentally, physically, and economically. Mentally, many Yemenis are suffering from PTSD, trauma. I am one of them. It is awful because we are in a stress zone, in a war zone, and we live in a continuous status of stress where you don't know what is going to happen. So there is something that would happen every day. You would pass by a checkpoint, and someone will explain this checkpoint. Air bombardment will happen, and you're just in a survival mode every single day. And to be honest, this have even affected me on my health because of the continuous, stress status I was in all the time. Economically, it is hard, and Summer have talked about it a little bit. But for those who don't know, the public sector workers in Sana'a have not been paid regularly since 2016, and has been awful because many households depend on the government wages. And in the south, the problem of the currency inflation is crazy. In every single day, the exchange rates are different, the prices of food are different. And coming from a middle class family, for quite a while we had to give up on buying milk because milk was just too expensive for us to get. And we are a middle class family with 2 working people. What about the other million families who only depend on daily wages, and who only depend on a sole provider? So this is awful. And another impact with the violence and abuses against women. The abuses against women have reached a grave level in all of the country. Women now are being killed inside their houses, in the markets, in everywhere. And even the tribal codes we used to have collapsed, and the social protection that women used to have is gone. Attacking women now in Yemen is not a black shame like it used to be. The third thing is the effect on young people. Me, one of them, being a young person in Yemen is very difficult right now. First of all, we are excluded in every single aspect, especially from leadership positions, and every aspect in peace building. Although we are doing a lot of things on the ground, but we are still excluded. And young people were the fuel for the Arab Spring in Yemen, and they had a great representation during national dialogue. But now, unfortunately, the design process, it's not very designed to empower us as young people and also as women. The second thing is young people have lost the means of earning money, and this is making many of them want to join the army or want to join armed groups, because now it is the only way to get a job to feed your family. I know, unfortunately, I know friends who told me personally, like, how can I support my family? You know, Nisma, employment rates are sky high, and even those young people who want to start their own businesses and be entrepreneur, they face the challenges of the collapsed economy. Every day the exchange rate is different. Importing goods is very expensive, and they cannot deal with it. So these are, summary of the challenges and things that are facing young people and Yemenis. And as I told you, that I want to highlight the efforts of the women, and the women in Yemen are literally tiptoeing minds to help families. They have negotiated with armed groups and released detainees, end conflict over water and land. And with doing all of these great things, we're still hearing a very, unreasonable excuses with why women should not be there. We're always questioned by national, international actors. Who are you? What do you want? And they're questioning our qualifications, our agency, our role. And these are not reasons for, to exclude women, because they are half of the society. And Yemeni women already had a very successful model with the national dialogue, where we had 30% representation. And since 2015, unfortunately, what we say that the UN-led process is designed to exclude women, and they deal with women inclusion as a tick box exercise, that they just, okay, we included women, we're good. And this is not just a talk on paper, and they're not actually doing this. And with the intentional exclusion that the UN is doing, represented by their UN Special Envoy Office, this have led the national actors to replicate their what they do. And now, for the first time in 20 years, Yemen have 0 female ministers. So women representation have just fall down from 2 to 3%, and we have 0. As women, we have not, gave up and said, okay, we did our best. We have sent letters to the president, minister, parliaments, did lobby meetings. But because of the national patriarchy and the international patriarchy, all of these calls were ignored. And now we are dealing with very complicated situation, because of it's a consequence of the UN actions in Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisma, for your intervention. It's passionating to hear you. And as you said, women, Yemeni women are not, they're often being sidelined, not listened to, not involved in any process, when actually they are the root of everything. They are doing so many things. They are doing everything actually, and they are in the peace building efforts. They are leading Humanitarian, as we have heard before, the humanitarian relief, conflict prevention. They are holding the society, and not because, I often say that gender equality is not because women are nicer or kinder, or no, women are part also of the conflict. They are on both sides. They are not better, they're not worse, they're just half of the population, and as such they have to be represented with the diversity of what it means as well. So thank you so much for your insight, Nesma, and I will hand over to Sarah for your intervention, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for organizing this and following all of these incredible presentations with just astounding information. And every time that I speak or work on Yemen, I always pray that the next meeting will be more optimistic, But all I will say is that, you know, everything being presented today, the more we can talk about these issues, the more we have awareness, and the more that we can push the international community to do the right thing. And especially what Nesma just spoke about with women. There's so many things that just opens up that I want to think about and talk about and find out what we can do in that regard. I'm going to frame a number of issues briefly, and then anything following up in more detail during Q&A or anything, please do. I mean, there's been so much wonderful information presented. And what I'm going to kind of focus on is part of what we've been doing within the IBA and within other organizations on this, because the situation in Yemen is dire, and the destruction of infrastructure, erosion of civil institutions. I'm heartbroken to hear that the tribal courts are now breaking down, because that was one of those things that we always looked at when we saw the judicial institutions suffering from corruption or just closed doors and not operating. As well as the food insecurity, the economic situation, the lack of education. We have an entire generation of children that are being impacted for the rest of their lives from this. You know, the landmines are something that I focused very heavily on. Read a report a few months ago that the Houthis have improvised the mines set to trigger all the way down to 10 kilograms, which places children at greater risk versus an adult, and even disguising them as rocks, using plastics, making them harder to detect, and just horrific impacts that has on the society, which also, in addition to the psychological trauma that is created just from being in a 7-year war and a humanitarian crisis, there's going to be ongoing, you know, I remember being in Cambodia one time and a little boy was telling me, only walk on the dirt, don't walk on the grass, because he at 7 years old already knew that walking on the grass meant you might be at risk of stepping on a landmine. And the thought that that is going to be what Yemeni children are going to have to deal with for years to come is just devastating. The one thing I will say at the outset of my remarks is that Yemenis and local institutions have to be the lead on this. And far too often, the West and international organizations impose their views, their perspectives, many times ignoring the cultural and religious and historical important factors that are there. And it is so impressive to see so many organizations that are either in Yemen or the Yemeni diaspora working on this. And we need to make sure that your voices are the strong ones, and that your needs and your interests and your concerns are at the forefront, because you do know best what is going to work for your country going forward. We hosted a program in London where we actually had Yemenis from various parts of the country participate, and there was a very good dialogue. There were times where it was tense, but one of the things that they all agreed on was that if we don't reach some sort of forgiveness and reconciliation at some point, this war will continue for decades to come. And in the aftermath of the panel discussion itself, two Yemeni gentlemen from opposite sides of the country with very conflicting points of view actually embraced one another and promised to keep speaking after that. And so that's something that we look at as, maybe we can't do a big effort that encompasses everything, but if we can start small on some of this. I'll touch now on the FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation by the U.S. State Department. You know, we saw this coming last fall, you know, the very last minute decision from the outgoing Trump administration. And it's troubling. You know, sanctions regimes, especially from the US, have tended in recent years to be broad, to aspire to the old, outdated view, which most in Europe and other places of the world have felt that the imposition of humanitarian crisis and starvation on a civilian population does not have an impact on governments. It does not foster change, and it ends up doing more harm than good. Unfortunately, a lot of people still ascribe to this old regime. We're hopeful that the Biden administration will be more targeted in their sanctions impositions, will focus on individuals, will focus on the actual bad actors and disrupting their financial flows and their abilities to live their lives, which in some circumstances, we have a black market, we have a global market. If sanctions are not enforced multilaterally, they can have very little effect, especially with some of the EU regulations and blocking legislation that allows for exceptions. It was promising that the Biden administration, one of the first things that they did in the not even a week that he's been in office at this point, was to allow for an issuance of licenses, the exceptions to allow for humanitarian aid. There's been a very strong, as was already mentioned, response to this. And although what was released from the Treasury Department does not apply to specific Houthis who were subject to sanctions under other regimes, the fact that they are going to allow at least for 30 days, which then gives them time to re-examine the situation and respond to this. One other concerning thing that came out within the last 48 hours was a report that was submitted apparently to the UN Security Council accusing the Houthis of money laundering and corruption regarding about $2 billion in funds from the Yemen Central Bank that was from Saudi Arabia. It was meant to buy food items and commodities, stabilize prices so people could buy food. But the allegations of that money was transferred illicitly to the Houthis to fund the war. And so as we examine how to handle this, how to handle the money flows, it is a very difficult process. I do know that many of the international organizations, corporations, philanthropic efforts that do want to do work in Yemen, the problem that we've had over the last years is always the corruption, the sanctions, and hopefully now with especially the new mindset from the Biden administration to work closer with our EU and UK counterparts and to take a more global multilateral approach, that we can start to scale back the humanitarian impact of the last few years and have a smarter way of approaching this. From there, I'm going to turn to, following up, the medical crisis and health crisis, obviously, and that goes part of the sanctions is making sure that we can get medical supplies and other things into Yemen, especially with the COVID crisis. But the psychological impact is especially important. And it's something that those of us working in the international criminal law community have recognized, that trauma has often fallen on the side when we look at reparations and reconciliation, and it's not played a role. Ambassador David Sheffer, the former US Ambassador at Large for War Crimes, has spent the last 2 years really working on how we can make trauma treatment and trauma response part of the peace efforts, but also the post-conflict reconciliation and rebuilding. When you have children growing up learning to seek shelter from missile strikes or seeing dead bodies under rubble, when you have parents losing their children, not necessarily from the war, but from the humanitarian crisis, the starvation, the diseases, that's trauma. And you have families ripped apart as soldiers leave for the battlefield, unable to support their families, wondering if they're going to return. And so what we've really focused on is coming up with a new effort towards reconciliation that involves mental health treatment and trauma treatment, looking at acceptance, grief, forgiveness, and moving forward, understanding that you may need to live next door to someone who fought against you on the battlefield or committed atrocities against your family. And the good thing about this COVID environment is that it forced us to develop telehealth, telemental health, as well as looking at what we've done in Bangladesh and Syrian refugee camps around the world, training people using virtual therapy sessions. But this does have limits. And as we talk about the impact on women, and it's so disheartening to hear that now, whilst we hadn't seen for years reports of sexual violence against women as part of the conflict and widespread rapes that we've seen in other contexts, hearing about what's happening domestically and the domestic violence and the femicides, that's always troubling, because that's a societal problem that is so difficult to address, compounded by the fact, as all of you know, the difficulty in getting women to speak up and speak out. I recall a colleague who was working with the Yazidis once told me that no woman that she interviewed would ever admit to being raped, but every single woman who was interviewed knew someone else who had been, but they wouldn't give a name. And we all, we understand that dialogue, but it's also so important that the trauma for those women is addressed and that we implement both societal but also governmental means of making sure that women are empowered and protected and have that strong voice. The last couple of things I'll touch on, disability rights are also going to be an important aspect. Obviously, pre-existing within a population, but also those coming back from war who've been wounded, the ongoing problems with those who are injured or lose limbs due to landmines, and making sure that rebuilding and reconciliation efforts, there have been great strides in this area, especially in the region. And so we would hope that regional actors would bring in a lot of the programs and resources that they've developed to help this and ensure protections for people of determination. The last two things are a little bit related that I just want to address, and this goes to what we will need to do in terms of post-conflict, what that looks like, what types of accountability measures will be the most effective. And every conflict is different. Every conflict has different cultural and religious aspects that go into it. And this conflict, although it's technically a civil war, you have all of the outside actors that played a role. And Yemen has the strong tradition of tribal courts. Yemen has very incredible education systems and legal systems from the past. And so those are things that should be reintegrated into society and supported for these efforts. But it should be multifaceted. And it really needs to be something that looks at truth and reconciliation, returning fighters, reintegrating them into society, in jobs, in education, in ensuring the trauma treatment is there, but also accountability for offenses. And whatever that accountability looks like is something that I think for people, and I think that as Muslims, we're in a unique position in terms of what we're taught about forgiveness and even what Islamic law teaches about war crimes and post-conflict resolution and reconciliation. And I think there are some beautiful lessons there that can be drawn on, not just looking at what the ICC says and going forward with those regards. One thing I will note that I think is very important for Yemen and the process is that the IBA War Crimes Committee had a major effort to amend the Rome Statute to include the crime of the intentional starvation of civilians during a non-international armed conflict, a NIAC, which is what Yemen is considered. The crime already existed for wars between states, but in December 2019, the Assembly of State Parties to the ICC did adopt unanimously amending the statute to include starvation. And so whilst Yemen obviously and none of the other parties involved are parties to the ICC, when it comes to looking at your internal accountability and justice efforts, there is now concrete support from the international community regarding the starvation issues. So I'll just end by saying that whilst during this, the international coverage, the support did not always seem to be there, it's grown immensely in recent years, and that's due to a lot of your efforts. And I think dialogues like this are so important, and continuing to have more dialogues and bringing people in from various organizations so that we can hear from you what the problems are and what assistance is needed from us, because we all have hope in the people of Yemen, a beautiful country, a rich history, and we want to see it rebuild and become a robust and just blossoming part of the international community again.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your intervention. And yes, that's the idea of this event, is to also create a network and build upon relationship and put you in contact, and making sure that there is relationship that is built upon these discussions. So so thank you for that. We'll move now to the question. I apologize to the audience. We took a little bit more time, but the event that was planned for 1 hour 15. We have actually 1 hour 30 available for this part of event. So if those who want to stay longer, I know that Sarah Elizabeth will have to leave at in 20 minutes, but we can remain a little bit longer for those who want. So I'll open the floor for the questions. If we'll make it interactive, so no need to write. If someone wants to ask a question, just be respectful, of course. Don't speak together, I mean everyone at the same time, but you can just unmute yourself and ask your question. Any question? Don't be shy.
Hi guys, my name is Layla. Sada, thank you so much for putting this event together, and for all the speakers. I mean, we've learned so much today, and it's been incredibly emotional to like listen to and to hear. But I think like we can't really shy away from kind of the hardships that other people are facing. We really have to face them with them. So thank you guys all for sharing your emotions and being vulnerable about this. I just want to introduce myself. Thanks, Neda. My name is Layla Abi Falah, and I am part of the SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa working group. I'm on the leadership board and helping co-host this event. So my question is for Aisha. I saw all of, you mentioned the measles outbreak, the cholera outbreak. And one thing that I noticed, so I've been working in the Syrian context for the past few years. And one thing that I noticed is the reason we saw all the outbreaks in Syria and the reason the public health crisis happened in Syria was because the government was having a very well orchestrated campaign against public health. And we continue to see that with COVID today. And so, for instance, in areas that are controlled by rebels and by the opposition, we really saw that the government did not allow for medical aid to go in, did not allow for polio vaccines to continue, even though Syria was the most well-vaccinated country in the area prior to the conflict and prior to this campaign against healthcare. So is that why we're seeing those cholera outbreaks, those measles outbreaks? Is there kind of also this campaign of against healthcare?
The situation in Yemen is a little different. Okay. First of all, 50% of the health units have been destroyed either by airstrikes. The majority, actually, 70% of them were destroyed by airstrikes and 30% by internal fighting. So that's one thing. The other thing is also the economic impact on the country. So services and funding for the services has been, is severely undermined. The third one is a blockade also. So there is an international blockade on Yemen, although not a lot of people are talking about it. So entry of material into Yemen has been also severely challenged. For example, a lot of the equipment in the hospitals are very old. And if a machine breaks down, to get in parts to fix it is actually extremely challenging. So all of these have had a very devastating impact on the health of the population. We also have about 3.6 million internally displaced in Yemen. So you don't have the structure where people are in their homes. And to start with, Yemen, and a lot of people don't realize this about Yemen. Yemen is actually a mountainous country. So there are a lot of small settlements, thousands, actually, tens of thousands of settlements in the mountains that are very hard to reach. So to start with, a lot of these settlements were very hard to reach, but they had what was called mobile services. So they would have, cars that go and provide vaccination programs, for example. But when you are in a war situation, you're not going to be able to move as freely because every party to the conflict is suspicious that you're working with the other side. So that has really impacted the ability of people to move around as well.
Awesome. Is there any other questions or comments? Do we have a shy audience?
I'll ask a question. Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie. I am one of the co-chairs of the Human Rights Working Group with WCAPS. I am not very knowledgeable on Yemen, so thank you all so much for sharing everything that's been happening in Yemen. It's like Layla said, it's been really emotional to hear, but it's really great to hear how resilient the people are as well, and how beautiful the nation is. But I guess my question is, as someone who isn't very knowledgeable on Yemen and everything that's going on, what are some of the first steps that we can all take in bringing change for Yemen? What should we all be pushing for and advocating for when it comes to bringing relief to Yemen?
Who wants to take this question?
I want to answer it from feminist perspective, and I would want to give an example of how investing in women is very important in this period. So we have one of our partners called the Mothers of Abductees. They are networks of mothers who their children were abducted. They're mostly civilians, and mothers of abductees with their very little budget and very little and they're just group of mothers at the end. In the course of the past years, they were able to free 940 abductees. And on the opposite hand, you have the UN with their $36 million budget and hundreds of experts, and 2 years span were only able to free 1,000 person in October. So now we need to push more for investment in women, in local CSOs and in women, because it is more sustainable, it's cost effective, and women, they are very respected in their society, and they have proved that their ways work way much better than the Western and UN ways.
Great, thank you very much, Nesma. We have another.
Let me just also address this. I think the international community is complacent in the war on Yemen. I would specifically call the US specifically and the UK. They have supported the war. And so I think it's extremely important.
And France.
And France and Italy, and there are 37 countries that are providing arms to this conflict. And unfortunately, Rayathan CEO yesterday said that to his investors not to worry, the Middle East will continue to be a strong market for their investment. Rayathan is an arms industry company. So I think as individuals, it is important for us to call on our representatives, on our governments, especially in the West, to say they need to step up and they need to ensure that they don't support this war. I also would want to say that when the war on Yemen started, it was announced from Washington, DC. So the Washington, DC is complacent. It was announced under the Obama administration. It continued under Trump, and it is time for the US government to end support to this war.
I have just one point. I know we're gonna go loop around everyone. I do, because I think, Western perspective again, and I loved Sarah's point about this. And she said that the Western narrative is always being pushed on the local narrative in Yemen. And I think that's one of the main problems when it comes to even the design of the peace process in Yemen, as Nisma had kind of noted. And so the first is, I think for the average, individual here in the United States, obviously you can do some research, but also look at Yemen from, like I said, from a 2-point perspective, where ending the war in Yemen is not just ending the logistical, support from the West. That's only half of it. I mean, the other half is the local issues of how this war started, from 2014 via a coup. And for me personally, and I say this publicly all the time, I said, yes, logistics will stop. And I definitely believe under Biden's administration, it will stop. And that's something we welcome. But really the main problem where I think that everyone will forget about Yemen is when, Saudi coalition ends, then the local problems start. And that's going to be the main problem, I think, moving forward. And to me, it scares me most because the the West, and I say this as an American, honestly, the West focuses on Saudi Arabia because they have certain feelings towards them, and totally understandable. But when Saudi Arabia is not involved, people tend to forget. And so we don't want to be a forgotten nation. So definitely look at it from that perspective as well.
If I can add on that, I really appreciate what you just said, Summer. Also of you. I think that we tend in the West to focus, and that's not wrong, on only the Saudis. We have a very simplistic, most often simplistic understanding of the conflict in Yemen as a two-side thing. We don't necessarily understand actually what has led to the conflict, what has led to the war, because it didn't start in 2014. There is root causes that if we want to build peace, we have to actually tackle the root causes, and it's very old, and there is so many parties to the conflict. At regional level, we know them, but at the local level, at the national and regional inside the country, it's less often understood by the international community in the West. So I think it's really important to, what I would say on my side to answer the question is, first, as Aisha said, call for our representatives to stop the logistical support and to push for bringing back the parties to the table of negotiation and dialogue, but also trying just to understand and not stay in a binary vision of what is Yemen. Yemen is very complex, and if we want to tackle the issues that the country is going on through, we have to understand the complexity of it to adapt the response to it. That's what I just wanted to add on what has been very well said before me. If you're okay, we'll pass to the next question. We have one question written by Paul Nafi in the comment box. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
I can read it. Thank you so much. So the question is that about temporary protected status. So there are 10 nations which currently inside the United States benefit from temporary protected status designations, with different conditions per country. Yemen is one of the 10. And so the question is to the speakers of today's forum, not only the best way to advocate continuation of the protection given the conditions there, but also to improve it, maybe to another status, more comprehensive, given that it's very clear that given the situation inside Yemen, it's completely unreasonable to ask Yemenis to have to return to the country at this point. So that's the question.
Someone wants to answer, Aisha?
Okay, sure. I actually worked, again, because we do advocacy, we worked early on protecting supporting the TPS for the first batch, and then under Trump worked very hard to at least not revoke the ones that they already had TPS. I would be very happy to work with you, Paul, to ensure the continuation of this program. I think it's extremely critical that we continue that. And I suspect that this administration will be supportive. The hardest part was working with the Trump administration on this.
All right. I will pass the next question to Menti, who was raising her hand.
Thank you so much. My name is Minty. I'm a master's student at Georgetown. I'm so grateful for this forum and to get to hear from all of you, both from your personal experiences, but also your professional knowledge. I wanted to ask a bit about the funding landscape for aid operations in Yemen. As we know, the UN has consistently decried the fact that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the US, all of the major donors have fallen short of their financial contributions to aid in the country. I was wondering what you think any of the better solutions are to garnering resources towards the Yemeni people at the moment, financial resources. For example, would a private sector humanitarian bond be a good option? Maybe you don't have to speak to that directly, but any thoughts you have as to the best way to get money really to Yemenis is my question.
I'm going to try also to address this because this is something we've been working on as well. Again, the USAID and the US, under the Trump administration, they decided to cut funding for areas under Houthi control where about 70% of the population lives. And in addition to that, there was an international meeting of aid organizations for Yemen. And I would venture to say that the US also hijacked that meeting, and they do actually set the trend. So when they decide to cut funding, a lot of other organizations cut funding as well to Yemen. So the international call for support for aid to Yemen was reduced quite a bit and is still underfunded. And they continue to say that. Of the 41 programs that the UN was running in Yemen, 31 were closed due to funding problems. We are, as Yemen Relief and the Construction Foundation, we actually have looked into this issue, and we are working with an ex-ambassador, US ambassador to the UAE, who's helping us with this concept of getting funding through working with private institutions. So it will be interesting we just started with him at the end of last year. We'll see if, and it's private ventures, if that works. I'm actually very hopeful. But like I said, and Samar alluded to this as well, we do need to have, the Yemeni people are very hardworking. And wherever they go, they succeed economically. So we do need to start working on programs that allow the Yemeni people to earn their own money. And so economic empowerment will be one of the major things that I think international aid agencies need to focus on as we rebuild Yemen.
I'll just quickly add that, you know, Yemen, obviously through this panel, every time I hear it, it's just layers after layers after layers of problems. And so sometimes we even ask ourselves as Yemenis, where do we even start? But yeah, like I said earlier on the conversation, that the approach is not every country, I don't think any country deserves the status quo of humanitarian efforts, which is the basic, you know, food basket, help an orphan. And these are really crucial for certain things, and I definitely agree with that. But I think we have to divert ourselves into creating the solutions that we're always complaining about. So, I mean, for us, we found that working in sustainable development, like we've done greenhouses, we've done large solar energy projects for tens of villages. And so these are solutions that make a Yemeni more, I wouldn't want to say proud, but I feel like they're more respected because Yemen, and this is why Yemen's world's worst crisis as well, is the Yemenis have a tribal sense in them that we don't ask for help. I can tell you this on a personal level. If I'm in the street, I would not ask for help. You know, I would just deal with it myself. And that's the tribal aspect of Yemeni. So no, we don't ask for help. But when we do, and I say this unfortunately today, I've never thought I would, is that when we do ask for help, we want them to be a solution that makes sense to them and not just a photo op for business related ventures, you know? So yeah, agencies, like for you example, you should work with Yemeni American organizations that deal with the transparency aspect. And I think that's really key here when it comes to auditing local capacities, you know, organizations that work on local projects. You know, I personally try to stay away from the larger organizations just because, again, the design is not appropriate for Yemen. So, you know, work with Yemenis who can maybe help in diverting what you think is best in Yemen.
Thank you, Summer. I know that Sarah has to leave soon for another meeting. Do you want to add something before you leave?
I'll just step in on that last point because I think it is important. And I loved hearing the focus on working with Yemeni organizations and the locals and the people who are on the ground. I know that's something that when we've had people come to us saying, how can we help? Who should we work with? And I also think that, you know, continuing that push in terms of the impact of sanctions and why they haven't been effective in terms of dissuading wrongdoing, but also working as Yemen rebuilds, you know, implementing those anti-corruption efforts, implementing the anti-money laundering, the financial sector, so that you can get a free flow of aid in, and that international organizations, corporations, you know, also, you know, sustainable giving is something that is becoming very large in the corporate sector, especially with the UN SDGs and other things. And so I think there's a really great opportunity for Yemen to capitalize as well on companies that want to do the right thing, that want to engage in development. And so I think pairing the rebuilding as well with the green technology, climate change, you know, the corporate social responsibility and doing good, I think the environment is very, very good for that. And hopefully we can get the legal concerns out of the way to really get some good investment flowing in to assist the Yemenis in rebuilding as they want to rebuild their country.
There are many comments saying thank you to the speakers, and I can only back up that. Thank you so much for your great insight. We might take a last question if there is one, and then we'll end up on that. Does anyone wants to add a last question for our panelists? All right. Well, I think that we can say thank you to, again, our great, fantastic women who have agreed to join on such a short notice for this event. Again, thank you very much to the team who have helped organize and set up this, this discussion, very important discussion. And to all of you, the audience, the participants who are here to listen to these voices. At WCAPS, we really, it's really important, and it's at the core of our mission to bring the voices of women, women of color, women who are leading change, and women who are leading action actually to change the shape of what we frame as peace and security, and to bring their expertise and raise their voices. So thank you very much for being there. I would say that I know that in the audience we have people from very diverse background. We have journalists, we have experts in the human rights, humanitarians, etc., working in policymaking. I would just ask you all to please continue the discussion on Yemen. Yemen needs to be, the discussion has to continue, and light has to be, it has to be shed on Yemen. So please continue to speak about it, organize events, or just talk about it with your network, with your colleagues, and please raise awareness on the situation. I thank you very much again, and I tell you a very good evening or day, depending on where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
And feel free to visit the website of WCAPS, I feel like I'm doing an advertising something, but wcaps.org, basically. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.